A quick warning. Due to the graphic nature of today's topic, parental discretion is recommended for listeners 13 and under. Today's topics include discussions of violence, murder, and death. The views and opinions discussed on today's show may not be the views held by the hosts, but those of historical figures mentioned. As you listen, we ask that you keep in mind that one must tread with care when looking back in time and not judge the actions and opinions of others by the standards of today. Heyo, trippers! Welcome to another episode of the Road Tripping Podcast. I'm your host, Dean Ward, and in the studio with me is the lovely Molly Malloy. As always, it's great to have you tuning in. If this is your first episode, then welcome. If it's not your first episode, then welcome back. We want to take this opportunity to say thank you for letting us provide you with content that helps your commute suck just a little less. It really means a lot to us that you're listening. Speaking of listening, if you've been tuning in from either our homepage or through our host Buzzsprout, we want to say thank you and please continue to do so. But if you use any other apps, we just want you to know that you can likely still hear us for free on those apps. We are listed on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and iHeartRadio, to just name a few, to make it as convenient to find us as possible. If you use some other app, then you can check out our complete list of where to find the show by going to our subscribe page from the roadtrippingpodcast.com website. It will show you everywhere our feed can be found.
Today, we are featuring a show suggestion from Beatrice M. of Canton, Ohio, who writes, "Hey guys, love this show. I've been listening to you on Spotify since the third episode and thought, you know what? I will send them a suggestion. What could it hurt? Let me say that I'm kind of an odd duck, as my husband says, and really enjoy what most people call oddities from around the world. I just find it fascinating. Anyways, I've always wondered about shrunken heads. What do you guys know about them? Thanks and keep it up. Beatrice." Well, Beatrice, until we got your suggestion, we knew absolutely nothing about them, except knowing that they existed and seeing them in the movies and on TV. But we took your challenge and dove in to research and see what we could discover. I think the first one I ever saw was probably in the 1993 film The Nightmare Before Christmas, but that was not a real one. Let me tell you guys, the real thing is much more bizarre looking. In fact, what you could easily take them for is some cheap store decorations or an old doll's head that someone's tried to make look scary. Due to their size and the fact that most places in the world never had practice of making them, they just don't look real. I've included some pics in the show notes, which you can find on our website, theroadtrippingpodcast.com. That's tripping with a G, under the headlights link under the homepage. Before we get ahead of ourselves and too far into the conversation, let's give you some background history.
Behavior that is unusual or outside of the norm and thus considered bizarre by others either finds in us a curiosity to know more or is found to be repugnant and drives us away from it. The taking of human heads is one of those behaviors that is easily outside of the normal behavior of most peoples throughout the world today, and thus one that is looked down upon and of course is criminalized in civilized society. Throughout history, the taking of a head and putting it on display was done to deter criminals, bring shame and insult against your enemy, prove your skills as a warrior, cosmological balance, ritual, such as bloodletting of a stranger onto fields for a good harvest, and prestige, both in this world and the next. Many cultures believe that the head was the core of a person, and it was a common belief that the soul was concentrated in the head, and that taking an enemy's head therefore weakened the enemy culture. In many headhunting societies, taking a head was considered a rite of passage into manhood, and in some cultures, young men were forbidden to marry until they had claimed one. Headhunting has been documented in Melanesia, the islands west of Papua New Guinea, Southeast Asia, by the Maori of New Zealand, China, Japan, Taiwan, on the Indian subcontinent, in the Amazon, by Mesoamerican civilizations and European cultures, such as the Celts, the Scythians, and Montenegrins. The Celt example I found particularly interesting as I am a fan of archaeology and anthropology. Indiana Jones is my hero, thank you very much. And I recently, and not as part of the research for this show, saw an article where there was still debate on what type of oil was actually used by the Celts to preserve the heads that they took and put on display. Academics, what can you say? Anyway, from the Americas, a good example of head taking would be the ancient Nazca Indians of Peru. Usually for ritual use, there was a long history in the central Andes prior to 1800 BC, all the way through the time of the Incas, where almost every major culture of that area, including the Chavín, the Cupasnique, the Mochi, Paracas, Nazca, Wari, Chimu, and Inca, who all participated in this tradition. The Nazca even frequently depicted severed human head figures on their ceramics and in their textile works. The Nazca were an extremely aggressive culture, and part of the head taking for them was psychological impact that seeing the heads on the belts of the warriors and shamans would have on their enemies. There is some belief that the Nazca believed that there was a transfer of power from the fallen enemy to themselves by having the heads. The connection to the spirit world was integral to their culture and belief systems, so that isn't too far-fetched. To accomplish this, once they defeated their enemy, they would sever the head, break away the occipital bone, remove the eyes and brain, punch a hole through the skull, and then tie a rope through it. It was also common to pin the lips shut with thorns and stuff the skull with cloth. Pretty morbid, right? Since that area of the world is one of the driest on the planet, mummified examples still exist. If you happen to be one of our listeners in Chicago and can get over to the Chicago Field Museum, you can see some in person.
Definitely a morbid practice. Even more so, the refinement of the taking of a head as a trophy that we're going to be focusing on now. When you think of a shrunken head, what do you think of exactly? For most people, it conjures up an image of an orange-sized doll-like head and not the ones Dean was just talking about. These are called sansa and are an ancient traditional technique of the Jivaro Indians, which is made up of the Shur, Acarara, Hiambis, and Aguarana, located between the upper mountains of the Andes to the tropical rainforests of northern Peru and southern Ecuador, which are said to be not only the only known group to perform in its modern times, but also the only documented head shrinkers in the world.
Fun fact: when discussing time, when the speaker uses the expression, in modern times, the speaker is generally referring to anything that has happened from the 18th century CE until today. If the expression early modern times is used, the speaker is referring to the years 1500 to 1800 CE.
Interestingly, but not surprisingly, the arrival of Westerners, in particular the British, resulted in an increase in headhunting and the death toll, as Europeans provided an eager market. Trade initially was for firearms and ammunition. The price was often one gun for one head. Then, in the early 1900s, they began to be found in curio shops in Peru for currency instead of trade. Initially, about the equivalent of a British gold sovereign, or £1 sterling, roughly $50 US today. By 1930, the price was usually around $25 US, or $385 today. Eventually, the Ecuadorian and Peruvian governments passed laws banning the exports of human heads. Once sold for mere dollars, shrunken Jivaro heads now commanded prices of thousands of dollars each. So, we know you are all wondering just how it's done, right? Well, just you stay tuned in, and I will reveal it all right after a word from today's partners.
As we have said many times before, Molly and I love to listen to different and exciting podcasts in the hopes of learning new things. In fact, our studio playlist runs all day while we are researching and often deep into the evening before we must finally stop. If, like us, you can't get enough, especially in the true crime genre like Molly, here are two new and fresh podcasts that we highly recommend you subscribe to. Have a listen.
Hey y'all, I'm Amanda.
I'm Erin.
And we're the hosts of One More Crime Podcast. Have you already binged every true crime podcast available?
Are you still craving more? We got you covered.
Join us, two lifelong best friends who share a love of all things true crime. Every week, you'll get one more crime with us. So grab a drink
Or don't.
and let us tell you some true crime stories.
Find us anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Are you obsessed with crime? Then boy, do I have a podcast for you. I'm Kaylin Lois from a Crime Story podcast. I am originally from the United States, but I now live in France. And when I moved here, I started hearing these insane crime stories. And I created a Crime Story podcast to tell you all about it. Every Wednesday, a Crime Story podcast will cover a international crime, from Germany's Hinterkaifeck murders to France's Petit Gregory and the Dupont de Ligonnès mystery. You can listen to a Crime Story podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, acrimestorypodcast.com, or YouTube at a Crime Story podcast. And remember to stay safe at home and abroad.
Welcome back, Trippers. So naturally, anything that's supposed to be a secret can be found online. So after some digging, here's what we could find regarding the process. Again, be sure to check out the show notes so you can get a full picture. How to make a shrunken head. 1. Remove the skull from the head. To do this, an incision is made on the back of the neck and all of the skin and flesh is removed from the cranial part of the skull that holds the brain area. The skull is then discarded into a nearby river and left as an offering to Pani, the anaconda. 2. Red seeds are planted underneath the eyelids, which are then sewn shut with native fiber. 3. 3 palm pins are used to hold the mouth together. These will be removed later and replaced with dangling strings. 4. Excess fat is removed from the head and a wooden ball is placed inside in order to keep the form. 5. The head is then placed in a sacred boiling pot or a cooking jar and boiled in water that contains a mixture of herbs that contains tannins, substance that helps tan the skin of the head into leather. The head is simmered for approximately 1.5 to 2 hours. Not too long or the hair will fall out. The skin is dark and rubbery when the head is removed from the pot and is about 1/3 of its original size. 6. The skin is turned inside out and all of the flesh still clinging to it is scraped off with a knife. The fully scraped skin is turned right side out and the slit that was originally made in the neck area is then sewn up. 7. Hot rocks and sand that are collected nearby are used to sear the interior and help dry and cause final shrinking of the head. The human features are retained and molded in the process. The Jivarone tribe is especially concerned with realism and the careful preparation of the head in order to maintain the original likeness of the slain victim's face. The heated stones are dropped in one at a time through the opening in the neck and are constantly moved around inside to prevent the skin from being scorched. 8. When the skin becomes too small for the stones to move around, sand is heated in a food bowl and substituted for the rocks. The sand enters all the nooks and crannies of the ears and nose where the heated stones cannot reach. This process is repeated for as long as necessary. 9. Hot stones are applied to the exterior of the face to seal and provide final shape to the features. 10. Excess hair is singed off and the final product is hung over a fire to blacken and harden. The lips are dried by applying the flat edge of a heated machete, which is a long, flat, sword-like knife, to them. 11. The skin is rubbed down with charcoal ash. 12. The 3 chanta, palm pegs, are then put through the lips, which are then lashed together with string. 13. The head is finally decorated with beads if desired. In 1961, Polish explorer and documentary filmmaker Armando Bielowski made what is believed to be the only footage showing what appears to be the Shore's head shrinking process.
The practice of preparing censas originally had a religious significance and was very ritualistic. Just like the Nazca I mentioned earlier, shrinking the head of an enemy was believed to harness the spirit of the enemy and compel him to serve the shrinker. It was said to prevent the soul from avenging his death. The Shur believed in the existence of three fundamental spirits. The Wakani, innate to humans, thus surviving their death. The Eratum, literally vision or power, protect humans from a violent death. The Muzak, the vengeful spirit, which surfaces when a person carrying an Eratum is murdered. To block a Muzak from using its powers, they severed their enemies' heads and shrank them. The process also served as a way of warning their enemies. Despite these precautions, the owner of the trophy did not keep it for long. Many heads were later used in religious ceremonies and feasts that celebrated the victories of the tribe. Accounts vary as to whether the heads would be discarded or stored. The Shur also believed that the captured Muzak would allow them the power to control the labor output of their daughters and wives, as their work harvesting the manioc tubers, which brought in the bulk of their calories in their diet, was paramount to their daily survival. But like all things, especially ritualistic or cultist things, someone comes along to either try to exploit it for profit, for power, for fear, or for all of the above. Earlier I mentioned my favorite hero growing up was Indiana Jones, but you can't think of him without thinking of his nemesis for almost every movie: the Nazis. Among all their listed atrocities, you can add the fact that during the later stages of the war, the Nazis were making shrunken heads out of their prisoners, and especially out of enemy combatants. During the Nuremberg trials, evidence was presented that the Buchenwald concentration camp, infamous for being where prisoners were sent to be literally worked to death, SS Dr. Mueller and Chief Dr. Lolling requested and received instructions on how to prepare shrunken heads. The testimony stated that the doctors prepared a sizable number of heads according to those methods. Not for ritual, not for religion, but because they could. There's a famous picture that was presented during the trial that showed a table full of Nazi experiments and includes 2 shrunken heads. I will make sure that it gets put in the show notes. One of them came into the possession of American soldiers of General Patton's Third Army after they liberated the camp, and after the war, ended up at the Walter Reed Hospital Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington, D.C. However, at some point it was stolen. The second head is said to be still in Germany. Well, that's all the time we have for on this episode of the Road Tripping Podcast. But if you liked it and want to hear more, please subscribe to the show feed and give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast directory. The more positive reviews we receive, the more trippers will be able to find us, and the faster we will grow, thus being able to bring you new content. Be sure to visit our website, theroadtrippingpodcast.com, that's tripping with a G, to keep updated on future shows, leave show suggestions, and to see all the ways to find and interact with us all in one place. If you are able and are feeling generous, then a link to our Patreon page can be found under the support link on the homepage. As always, until next we meet, stay safe, trippers.